Welcome back to the Indicator 13 Compliance Module series. We're going to be covering the grid in Module 5. As a reminder, if you've not already done so, please pause the recording to take your pretest. Remember, you'll need your PPID number in order to complete the survey. The purpose of this series is to enhance practices for writing compliant transition-based IEPs and to broaden the foundation for effective practices related to Indicator 13 of the State Performance Plan. In Module 1, we reviewed agency invitation and participation, as well as the student invitation and participation to the IEP team meeting. In Module 2, we discussed age-appropriate transition assessments. In Module 3, we covered writing post-secondary goals for education and training, employment, and independent living. In Module 4, we covered making sure that post-secondary goals have been updated annually. Now, in Module 5, we'll be focusing on correctly filling out the transition grid, as well as ensuring that the courses of studies are completed correctly in the grid, and that all activities in the grid are listed for all 3 goal areas. In our final module, we'll be covering making sure that measurable annual goals are linked and listed in the transition grid. The specific language in the cyclical monitoring compliance file review for question 292 is, are the location, frequency, projected beginning and anticipated duration, and person or persons agency responsible for each activity or service documented appropriately? So let's take a look at what that means. Let's look at location, frequency, beginning date, duration, and person or persons responsible. For each goal area, we want to make sure that there's a service or activity listed. Next, we want to state where that location will take place. In the frequency section, we want to address how often that service or activity is going to happen. And we want to make sure that we document the projected beginning and anticipated duration under dates. For the projected beginning date, it must be the same as the IEP date for our measurable annual goals as a service. Again, the duration must also be the same as the IEP date. And then we want to make sure that we are documenting and listing by title, not name, the persons or agencies responsible. One thing I do want to caution you on is to remember that the LEA, the local education agency, is the owner of the IEP. So if they're putting an agency, such as the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, and OVR isn't staffed appropriately due to a shortage or a change in a position, the LEA is still responsible for making sure that service or activity has occurred. So just please be cautious that just because you think it's somebody else's responsibility or you document it, that you're aware that it's still your responsibility as an LEA to make sure that activity happens. And if something like that happens and you're not able to make that activity happen, that you revise the IEP and document why that activity was not able to occur. You also want to make sure to list at least one activity. And you want to make sure that you're addressing where and how often, as well as if there are some time-limited activities based on when something will happen, that you're documenting that in the projected beginning and end date, as well as how long it will continue. And again, making sure that you list the person or agency responsible by title and not name. The next compliance language for item 292A is, do transition services include courses of study that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals? Let's talk a little bit more about what course of study means. What are courses of study? Courses of study should be part of the coordinated set of activities that helps that student move from high school to their identified post-school goals. And they should be supportive of academic and functional achievement. In addition, courses of study should promote graduation by meeting the district and state standards. The courses that a student takes should be aligned with post-secondary goals and can include programs of study at career tech ed centers, whether they're exploratory or laboratory-based programs. In addition, courses should be listed by the course name used in your local education agency's program of studies. We don't want to say things like functional curriculum or college prep unless that's how it's listed in your program of studies. So for example, if a student is taking English 9, but they receive an intervention in English 9, we don't want to call the course the name of the intervention. We want to call that course English 9. Also, courses of study must reflect the student's current year's courses. So this is important because a current year's courses could, in an IEP term, cover 2 functional spans. And so we want to make sure that we are including that year's courses and potentially the anticipated courses for the following year, since the IEP would cover 2 spans. Or you're going to have to revise that IEP at the beginning of the school year. Also, if you do the anticipated course of study for the following year, you may have to come back to that and reflect it if something in that course of study changes. So where do we list course of study? In each of the IEP goal area for post-secondary goals, there is a specific section in the grid that says courses of studies. And you want to list those current courses by name here, including any CTE, Career Tech Ed program of studies that the student might be involved in. For example, Algebra 2, Chemistry, English Literature, etc. And again, we encourage under a best practice to include projected courses because an IEP may cover more than 1 school year.
Here's our third compliance-related file review question. Are there transition services in the IEP that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals? So what are services and activities? These are action steps that help the student support movement towards those post-secondary goals. We kind of described them before as needs as well. So these are things in the transition part of the IEP that says, these are the skills that I need in order to be able to meet this post-secondary goal. These skills should be addressed during an IEP school year. Each post-secondary goal must have at least one service that is tied to a measurable annual goal to address a skill deficit, such as reading or writing, behavior or organization, or maybe a functional skill. And then there must be at least one activity. These are other activities that help the student reach his or her goal. And they are all part of a coordinated set of activities. Here's some examples of services and activities. Remember that a service is specifically connected to a skill deficit. So you can remember it like that, S and S. A service is connected to a skill deficit, which leads to a measurable annual goal and does include progress monitoring. So it might be building vocabulary skills or skills around writing conventions, learning to board a bus, comprehending figurative language, initiating peer reactions, or improving skills with budgeting, time management, algebraic equations, following 3-step directions, or self-advocacy skills. These are just some examples. And then some examples of activities. These are provided to help students achieve post-secondary goals, but they don't need to have measurable annual goals attached to them. So they might be things like visiting a college fair or a job fair, completing a virtual tour of a college or of an employer, completing a career portfolio, job shadowing for 4 hours for 9 weeks, or meeting with a guidance counselor to review a graduation plan or senior project. It could be a group or an individual meeting with OVR. And it might be something you do to help support voter registration. Here's some additional examples of post-secondary activities. Exploring post-secondary programs, college fairs, virtual tours, guest speakers, college visits, learning about accommodations, contacting that disability services office, information on registration for a PSAT or an SAT or an ACT. It might be some work around time management that may be connected to activities, or that may in fact be a service. Practicing your disability disclosure, reviewing a PYLN toolkit, and developing a list of questions for schools as you go to visit. Here's some additional examples of activities. Just exploring careers, having that opportunity to see what's out there, visiting or having a tour of the local career and tech ed center, creating a career portfolio, going to a job fair, listening to a guest speaker, having a community visit or a field trip, doing a research paper on a career of interest, reviewing employment ads, doing community service or job shadowing, resume writing, graduation projects, a group meeting with OVR, exploring things like PA Career Zone, military visits, or talking with junior ROTC, getting a little bit of work experience, and exploring job accommodations network. Here's some examples of independent living activities. Participating in clubs, shopping, family and consumer science activities, practicing budgeting activities or food preparation. You might be checking listings for apartments or other places to live, visiting community recreational facilities, maybe opening a case with an agency or obtaining a bus pass, learning about transportation options, helping with voter registration, or driver's education. We want to remind you to take advantage of services and activities that may be a part of the general education curriculum. Activities may take place in general education courses, as part of regular guidance services, or other school activities that are happening. Be sure to list these in the transition grid as appropriate. Many districts may actually map out these activities by grade. You might want to contact your secondary transition IU consultant to take a look at a secondary transition mapping guide example. So you may be asking, where do I put these in the grid? The IEP team should determine which skills need to be prioritized and therefore need to become measurable annual goals. Once they are prioritized, each of these measurable annual goals should be referenced as a service within the grid under one of the post-secondary goals. And just a reminder that each post-secondary goal area that is selected must have at least one measurable annual goal attached to it. And then we think, what other activities would be provided to help the student achieve her post-secondary goals? You should list a minimum of at least one activity under each post-secondary goal area. So one service and one activity under each of the selected post-secondary goal areas. So here's a sample of what a grid might look like for Andrew, who has a goal of enrolling in post-secondary education and training in the area of cosmetology or a related field. Note the courses of study, as this IEP will span more than one school year. So courses are listed in the 22-23 and 23-24 school year. Under services and activities, you see that 2 have an asterisk next to them. This is not a compliance-based requirement, but it's something that we recommend to help you and those reviewing the IEP notice that these are the 2 services that will have a measurable annual goal attached to them. So we see a skill deficit in solving algebraic equations. Therefore, we've included a service to build those skills. And the same is true for increasing writing fluency and the willingness to write. These will both have measurable annual goals attached to them, as we've seen a skill deficit identified by assessment. And finally, we see an activity to visit the Career and Technical Education Center because this is where he thinks he wants to go. This would be an activity noted in the transition grid.
Great. And so throughout this video, we've been talking about the transition grid with its course of study and its related services and activities to those measurable goals for life after high school. And as we've been talking about this, my first question is, can we combine a student's goals into one service?
That's a great question. So I'll give an example for a student who maybe has goals in reading comprehension and reading fluency. Those could be lumped into one service with a statement like develop reading skills. However, we wouldn't want to lump across content areas. For example, if a student has a goal for reading, writing, and math, we wouldn't want to lump those all into one service because there are specific skills that need to be addressed and may be related to specific post-school goal areas as well.
And when we're talking about our academic and functional measurable goals, should all of those academic and functional goals, so speech, OT, PT, behavior, should they all be referenced in the transition grid of services?
They should. Everything that's listed in the present ed level as a need should be listed as something that needs to have a skill built around it. So speech, OT, PT, behavior, these are all functional needs. They should still be listed in the transition grid. We should be able to connect each one of those things that are listed in the present ed levels as a need into that transition grid, because we want to see what are the skills needed to build success for that student as they move forward towards their post-secondary goals. So sometimes what happens if we're not seeing those connections is we see a service or an activity that continues to be included in a student's IEP, but has no real relation to what's happening in the post-secondary environment.
And while we're completing and building out this transition grid, what if we're not addressing a post-secondary goal? Do we just leave that aspect of the grid blank?
So no area of the IEP should be left blank. If you're not addressing a goal, there should be a statement in the grid box indicating that the IEP team has decided that a goal is not needed. But I do want to caution you, if you're not developing a goal, you need to make sure that you have evidence via assessment, both formal and informal, and other data sources in the present education levels that support why a goal is not needed.
So in continuing our conversation about completing the transition grid and what and where to add our information, when would you check no that there is not a measurable annual goal aligned to a post-secondary goal?
Matt, this is often something that's confusing for people. So keep in mind first that post-secondary goal is that picture of where the student is going to be going after high school. So whether that's going to a university program or starting right into some type of employment, that post-secondary goal is written out there. And then right next to it, usually on a form, there's a little checkbox that says, are there measurable annual goals aligned to that? If you've said, yes, there is a post-secondary goal, then what you're in effect saying is that there are still skills needed to build towards success for that particular individual. So you would always check yes if you've got a goal listed there. But if, for example, you have one of those situations where maybe there's a student who does not need something in independent living, and you've denoted that and you've said in the IEP that in the present ed levels that this student really is not demonstrating the need for us to develop any skills around independent living at this point. In that case, you'd have that statement in there that the IEP team has determined that no goal is needed at this time, and that's the only time you would check no in that box that a measurable annual goal is not needed.
And there's a lot of different ways, and I know we've mentioned this as well, the idea of mapping out some of these courses of study, the services and activities. And I'm wondering, why would a district want to map out activities and assessments per grade level?
That's a great question. So first and foremost, there are lots of things that happen throughout the curriculum and through the comprehensive school counseling plan that all students have access to. And having that mapped out serves as a starting point for all students across grade levels to see what data already is available on that student, and maybe help to identify what further assessments and or activities would help us to gain more information needed to support that student in attainment of their post-school goals.
Great, so that was an excellent conversation about our grid for transition planning. We just want to remind you all before we wrap things up that if you have additional questions about the content covered in this video, you can reach out and contact an educational consultant, and you'll be able to reach them through the secondary transition directory. That's on patent.net. Our last bit of information here, don't forget to take the post test. You'll need your PPID number in order to complete that survey.